You know, when we think about war, our minds usually jump to history books, right? Dates, battles, strategies. But what about the human truth of it all? The real experience? See, war poetry isn't just a description of fighting. It's this incredibly powerful and often brutal form of truth-telling. It gives a voice to the soldier on the ground, capturing an experience that history books just can't. So, let's dive in and see how.
Alright, so here's our game plan. We're going to start by looking at how poetry stares right into the face of conflict without blinking. Then, we'll break down the old myth of glorious war and see how these poets shattered it. We'll even do a deep dive into the anatomy of one truly iconic war poem. And finally, we'll unpack why this art form is such a vital human document, preserving the timeless truth of what it's like to be a soldier.
So what exactly are we talking about when we say modern war poetry? I mean, people have been writing about war since forever. Think Homer. But the poetry that came out of World War I, that was something different. It was a complete, radical shift away from all those old heroic traditions. A total game changer.
At its heart, war poetry is a voice for anyone whose life has been shattered by violence. But what made the poetry of the Great War so new, so different, was the war itself. For the very first time, poets had to figure out how to talk about this anonymous, mechanized slaughter. It was a kind of horror the world had never seen, and the old heroic language, well, it just wasn't up to the task.
And this is absolutely crucial to understand. You can't separate what these poems say from how they say it. The limping, broken rhythms, the gritty, stark images, the chaotic structures, those aren't just fancy artistic choices. No, that is the trauma. That's the experience of the soldier, the chaos of the trenches, woven right into the very fabric of the poem itself.
Let's dig into that a little more. These soldier poets were caught in this massive cultural collision. On one side, you had all the romantic, patriotic stories about the glory of war that they grew up with. And on the other, you had the horrific industrial-scale reality they were living and dying in.
And you can see that conflict laid out so clearly here. On the one hand, you have the old lie, these idealized, beautiful poems praising noble sacrifice for your country. But then, on the other hand, you get the brutal truth from the soldiers who were actually there. Poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, they used their words to bear witness to the mud, the poison gas, the absolute horror of it all. They weren't writing for glory, they were writing to tell the real, uncomfortable truth of a soldier's life and death.
Okay, so to really get how they did this, let's take one of the most powerful war poems ever written and look under the hood. We're going to use Wilfred Owen's masterpiece, Dulce et Decorum est, as a perfect case study to see how this new kind of poetry really works.
The poem slams to a halt with this absolutely devastating line, which is actually a quote from the ancient Roman poet Horace. It means, "It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country." But Owen doesn't offer it as some noble idea. He calls it the old lie. He takes this famous, classical phrase and just flips it on its head with the most bitter, gut-wrenching irony imaginable. Now, this is where the genius of the poem really shines through. The message is crystal clear, right? It describes the horrific death of a fellow soldier in a gas attack to prove that dying for your country is anything but sweet. But look at the form. The poem's rhythm is strained, it's limping, it's breathless, just like the soldiers themselves. The harsh sounds, the clunky words, they literally slow you down, forcing you to stumble through the lines. The whole poem feels exhausted and confused. See, Owen doesn't just tell you about the war, he makes you feel it. So these poets had to invent a whole new arsenal, a new set of poetic weapons, if you will. They used graphic, unflinching imagery of wounds and death. They used disruptive structures where the broken rhythm of the poem mirrors a broken world. They wrote as a first-person witness, making it feel less like a poem and more like urgent personal testimony. And of course, they wielded that bitter irony like a blade, cutting through the nonsense of incompetent leadership and blind patriotism.
Which kind of brings us to a bigger question. I mean, these poems are over a century old, so why do they still have such a powerful grip on us? Why do they still matter so much?
Well, because this poetry does so much more than just describe a battle. It forces us to ask tough questions about what heroism even means. It saves the stories of fear and guilt and comradeship that the official histories just sweep aside. It becomes this essential human document of suffering. And yeah, it was also a huge turning point for art, helping to kickstart modernism. But maybe most importantly, in the middle of all that horror, it insists on compassion, on the simple, powerful bond between soldiers. And that really gets us to the heart of it all. The truth these poets captured isn't just stuck in some muddy trench in 1917. It speaks to a universal experience, the experience of the soldier, anytime, anywhere.
So let me just ask you directly, do you think that experience, the suffering, the loss, the bonds you forge in the worst possible circumstances is truly universal? Does it echo across all the different wars and all the years?
The answer seems to be a powerful, resounding yes. This thought actually comes from a student connecting Wilfred Owen's work to a poem about the 1971 Indo-Pak War, decades later and thousands of miles away. It just goes to show that the core emotional truth, the pain of war, is absolutely timeless. The soldier's story of suffering and disillusionment is a tragic human story that we see again and again.
And in the end, that's what this poetry is for. Its purpose was never, ever to glorify war or to entertain us. No, when you boil it all down, it exists for one reason: to warn. It's a testament, a message in a bottle passed down through the generations, about the true devastating cost of conflict.
Which leaves us with one final thing to think about. Wilfred Owen and his generation of poets used their art to challenge the old lie of their day. And it just makes you wonder, doesn't it? What are the old lies that art needs to challenge today?